Yeah, that looks good. I think that's good. All good here. Recording here. Okay.
Should I put on my bison cap?
You can if you want. You don't need to. Jeremy Gingrich, thank you for coming down to Billings. Thanks for stopping in. Before we get started with this episode, you have a disclosure to make.
I do. Thanks for having me, Coulter. I did want to say that I'm employed by Turner Enterprises. I'm director of ranch operations for the Turner organization. But today, for our conversation, I'm representing myself, Jeremy Gingrich, and my interest in all things ranching.
You are representing your experience, Jeremy Gingrich, and I will try to keep the questions at that. I won't try not to ask about Turner Enterprises too much, but there's definitely going to be overlap in the discussion because I invited you on because I want to start a bison ranch.
Okay.
Where do I start?
Where do you start? The first thing, people have asked me that before, and the first thing I tell them is before you buy your first bison, make sure you have the marketing plan. So you know what you're going to do with them when you start raising them.
It kind of sounds like start with the end in mind.
Exactly.
How work your way backwards. Mm-hmm. Well, my marketing plan would be to just sell. I'm so traditional. I'm still an old cattleman, Jeremy. So just sell calves, but bison hunts as well. One bison hunt a week, $8,000 for an old cull bull. Do most bison producers just sell 600-pound calves, or is that a fallacy that I'm projecting livestock production onto bison that doesn't translate?
Yeah, it doesn't translate exactly. One of the things is your calves aren't going to be 600 pounds. They might be 350, 400. And so even at kind of analogous to a cattle producer, the more time that you can spend adding pounds with them, typically the better you're going to do as a producer. So in the bison productions model, typically things are almost a year behind. If you're breeding 2-year-old heifers, not yearling heifers, and so your first calves are going to come from you're going to calve as 3-year-olds, and so it kind of sets everything back a year. On the back end of that, the longevity of your cows can be really long. 19, 20-year-old cows is very common. So, a typical bison producer might be selling 2-year-old yearlings or 2-year-olds, or putting some on feed. And then, there are some wholesalers that are buying fed bison, or, buying long yearlings to put on feed, and then that's what's going into the wholesale market.
And this calf crop, bison calf crop, is 450 pounds is when you're weaning.
If you wean, it's another thing that you can rely on, kind of the adaptiveness of the animal, where those cows tend to dry up and they become naturally weaned until you gain the benefits of not having a stressful weaning. Cows you can winter with the cows. Cows are going to dry up and kind of naturally wean themselves. And it also, on the grazing side of things, you don't have as many herds. You can manage your grazing, having fewer herds, and giving more recovery periods for your grass as you're grazing.
So natural weaning, it takes place with the calf around 500 pounds. Because I'm trying to translate it as an old cattleman. It seems like a European cow will allow that calf to be on her tit up to 800 pounds. If you let him.
The cows will dry up. So wintertime, you're looking in December, January, those cows they never have much of a bag anyway, so it's really kind of hard to tell if they're wet or dry, but you can tell. They'll dry up. The calf, if you had a cow, a yearling and a 2-year-old, they'll kind of stay in a family group if you have them in that herd. And so you can see them loosely together but that calf's not going to be sucking all winter. So they'll naturally wean during the winter. And when I was referring to like a 350 or 400 pound cow, that'd be if you were weaning in the fall, maybe like you would like a beef producer, October or November. But if you leave them on, you gain that advantage, that kind of social advantage of, especially if the heifer calf that's going to turn into one of your replacement heifers, learning from the mother through the winter on how to survive in whatever that environment is. What's okay to eat, where the water is. You gain those advantages by not weaning and allowing that training to happen for the mother.
Well, that's starting to make sense to me now, because continental cattle and Bos Taurus cattle from the United Kingdom, for 3,000 years, we have selected cattle that will milk better. And what I hear from you is that we don't have 3,000 years of selective breeding in North American bison. So their natural cycle to be able to make it through the winter is to dry up earlier. And we just, as animal husbandry domesticators, people who produce bison or livestock, we just haven't been selecting replacement heifers out of bison for that many years, that we have these full bags through the winter.
Right.
Okay, that's starting to make sense to me.
Right.
On now, getting with that, you have operated bison ranches from New Mexico to Canada, I assume. Are they all calving about the same time?
There's a slight variation depending on latitude. The bulk, I would say, is May and June, but depending on latitude, they could calve somewhat earlier. An early April calf's an early calf. Typically, there's some in April. Montana would be a little bit start of the calving period later than New Mexico or even Nebraska. Another one of the nice things about running bison is you don't have to pull the bulls. Bulls can remain through the herd. Again, that reduces your number of herds, kind of that pain of pulling bulls and having them stuck somewhere in the bull pasture, which typically causes some grazing management, some range condition issues. The bison are cycling on nutrition more in line with natural periods like wildlife. And if you go on to ranching for profit or look at those cattle producers that are calving in the summer, that's kind of what bison are doing on their own without having to pull the bulls. You typically will have some later calves, they're called red calves, but it's not a significant portion. You might have calves born in July. They'll be lighter. They can get rolled into the next year's calf crop if they are too light. But to me, that's another one of the big advantages is you can run, in a lot of ways, you can run a single herd without having detrimental impacts to production, and you have a lot of positive impacts on your grazing management.
Well, that sounds excellent from a management perspective, is you don't have all these different enterprises. You don't have heifer development enterprise. You don't have a backgrounding enterprise for steers. I assume you're probably not banding and castrating, probably risking getting your neck broke by being out there screwing around with the bison too much. But you don't have a bull enterprise where you have to keep the bulls in a separate pasture. You have everything mobbed up in one pasture, and that sounds much more efficient. And sounds like natural breeding, natural weaning. This sounds too good to be true.
It's pretty good. It's in some ways, if I were to consider going back to a beef operation, I have to think pretty hard about it because of the advantages of bison. And there are times and places. I'm not saying that model or one mob works everywhere every time. There's times and places to have a yearling herd. Nice thing is you can mix bulls and heifers. You can mix bull and heifer yearlings. You may have a very small percentage of those yearling heifers get bred, but it's less common. So you can mix them, or you can run your yearling and 2-year-old heifers together if that fits your marketing model. It depends on how many you have and what your marketing looks like. the most difficult thing is not getting those 2-year-old heifers bred if you're running a single mom. So that's where you need to pull them out and run them separately.
Going back to marketing, are there value-added methods? So with beef cattle, you're forced to make the decision: am I going to go Gap 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, NHTC, USDA organic? What are the marketing norms for bison when it comes to value-added and labeling that product as it goes through the marketing channels?
Another one of the benefits of bison is consumer perception that they're all natural. It's kind of built into the species. Whether that's really how it is or not, there's a perception that at the outset is a benefit for the customer. And really, smaller bison producers that develop their own markets, they're their own certifier. Really, their reputation is their certifier and their brand. And so if you're looking at regional, that holds a lot of weight. I guess the further you get from home, the less weight that would hold. And so some of the major wholesalers, they're natural, definitely natural. But beyond that, there's not a lot of certification for bison. There's some American grass-fed certified producers. I can't think of other ones out there really.
Is there difficulty in marketing your product with beef? Any day of the week, I can haul a coal, a calf to the market. Any day of the week, I could consign a lot of calves to be on a video sale, and I have a ready liquid market all day, every day. Is that the same for bison?
It's definitely not the same for bison, and it really comes into play. If you look at drought management over the last couple of years, a lot of bison producers needed to destock, and you can't take a load of bison cows to the sale barn every week. And so that's where that planning your marketing ahead of time really comes into play. There's wholesalers that are killing several loads of cull cows every week, but if all the bison producers are getting routed out, it backs it up. And so one way around that is to plan. I would say any bison producer has to plan more conservatively with their drought strategy. You never know when the drought's going to end. You don't want to try to feed your way through it. So you need to stock less conservatively, I think, than you would if you were running beef, because just the time to get destocked is a lot longer.
I thought it was too good to be true. I'm guessing rather than shoot those animals because you don't have the forage, I'm guessing most people just haul in hay and try to feed their way through a problem, which is what the majority of cattlemen do as well. They're married to their genetics. So that brings up another question. Will I have to consider who the best bull producers are to bring in superior genetics, or genetics that are adapted to my locale, my elevation, my grass, my ecology? Am I going to have to consider EPDs on bison bulls?
Just like in the beef business, there's bison producers with different philosophies producing breeding stock. There's some that are more emphasizing performance on feed and those kind of bulls. And there's not an EPD system, but it's definitely performance testing on feed. And then there's other producers, and Turner Ranchers would be one, but there's others out there that emphasize production on prairie and adaptive genetics that way. No performance testing on grain. And so again, I think it comes back just like in the registered cattle business. reputation and philosophy of the breeder and how they fit your business model and what you want to do. And so you need to seek them out, look at how they're raising the animals, and look at the country, and hopefully that, you know, those bison breeding stock producers choose ones that are raising animals the same or a similar environment to your own, and your marketing system. You know, the goal at Turner Ranches is to raise those animals with limited amount of input, let bison be bison, let nature be the selector. You know, it goes back to if you've read the Lassiter Philosophy of Cattle Raising book written by Tom Lassiter, it's let nature make the selection. You know, sometimes we try to overcomplicate it, whether we're cattle producers or bison producers, but if we step back and let nature make the selection and help that along by, you know, accelerating that natural selection process, that gets us the most adapted animals.
I have not, Tom Lassiter. I recognize the name, and I do need to look into his work a little more, because that philosophy, I think that aligns with permacultural values. There's a guy, Mark, I forget his name, out of Wisconsin or Minnesota, I believe Wisconsin, but when he's setting up permacultural designs of resiliency on these farms in the Midwest, he just takes every damn seed he can for trees, berry bushes, fruit trees, fruit and nut trees, berry bushes. Those are the predominant fruits that he's perennial food systems that he's going to be planting out there. And he just throws it all out there usually in a swale, a furrow of some sort that's going to retain and capture moisture. But what lives. And that's what was meant to live. That's the one that outcompeted its neighbor, that outcompeted sodbound grass. And his belief, and it seems to be working, if that's what you want. I think harvesting would be a challenge, but his belief is that the genetics are there to win out, and you just got to let nature do its thing. And that seems to be your management philosophy, your practice as well.
It is. You know, I was when I first got into ranging, it was soon after I got out of college, and I was working for a rancher in southeast Colorado, and we were raising beef masters, registered beef masters. Some of them Dale Lasters at the time, and so that's a philosophy I was kind of trained in, and it applied there to beefmaster cattle. And I know they're not the right cattle for everybody everywhere, but in certain places they're fit. And marketing beefmasters or beefmaster crosses can also be, you know, a challenge. So you need to market them right. But bison are a lot the same way in the philosophy behind them. And they're already adapted. We don't have to take something that was, you know, a continental breed or something from the British Isles and try to adapt them to the semi-arid West. You know, bison are already there. We just got to stay out of the way and not mess them up.
One of my last guests, Sage Askin, he'd mentioned that the poor cattleman sees a profit about 2 out of 10 years. Is that the same for bison? Is it that hard to make it?
You know, I would say the economics are similar but somewhat disconnected, and the reason I say that is because the customer the amount of bison slaughtered in a year, let's for a round number, it's about 100,000
in the entire U.S.
Yes,
100,000 bison is it
annually. Yeah,
that is painfully small.
How many cattle do we kill in a day?
Yeah, that I can't believe it's that small.
So it's a niche.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a very small niche, and you start getting into some things like grass finished bison. It's a niche of a niche. The people, the customers that are buying bison, they're doing it because they believe in it, they like it, they want the meat, you know, all those reasons. And so it's somewhat disconnected. You know, it's somewhat inelastic, and so there's the advantage, or one of the advantages, I would say. So you can be low cost producer and have a higher price. So I would say it's maybe somewhat more consistent based on your ranching model than beef, where I'm not going to throw out a number of years in 10 that you'd be profitable, but I would say it's probably a little more stable in a beef operation.
100,000 killed a year. That just makes me think that you guys at Turner, you could be market manipulators. You could swing the whole market any day of the week you want. That also makes me think I should go breed up 200,000 head in the Australian outback and crush this American market with imports. That's what's happening with sheep is imports will swing that market so rapidly because, like you said, there's only a certain amount, like you're mentioning for bison. Sheep is very there's not a lot of buyers, not a lot of feeders, not a lot of players. There is liquidity, but it's heavily influenced by imports from Australia. That would be a challenge with bison. I mean, I'm sure you don't see the cutthroat market manipulation that sheep producers and processors have to deal with, and the oligopoly in the sheep industry or lamb industry, but which is much like beef, although the oligopoly is not JBS, Tyson, Cargill. It's guys who are not that big, but that sounds like a challenge going forward for bison, that it could be concentrated. And you, if I wanted to be a small guy with 20 head on the outskirts of Bozeman, this is a dream for a lot of people, and I've come to appreciate this dream of a lot of people. They want to move to the Gallatin Valley and have a small bison farm. It seems like they could be at the will of the big boys.
I wouldn't be concerned about that if I were wanting to get into it. One of the interesting things about the bison, I hesitate to call it industry because of the size of it. It's almost a community.
Yeah, okay.
There's kind of everybody's on the same team almost, because I know it's a small pool, and let's learn from each other, help each other out. The National Bison Association is a great resource for people who want to get into it. They have an annual meeting, a winter meeting every year in Denver. It's associated with the National Western Stock Show, and they have a trophy. The Gold Trophy Bison Sale is there every year, and that's the producers that are more performance testing bulls on feed. But there's everybody there, and it's not everybody in the bison industry agrees, how they should be raised necessarily. So there's differences of opinion if they should be all grass fed or it's not that big a deal, and it's okay. But everybody's still kind of on the same team. Let's grow the bison pool for everybody. The rising tide lifts all boats is kind of the philosophy. So it's a neat community that way. If you're the person that wants to have 20 head in Gallatin County, there's a couple of those around, and I'm sure they're probably direct marketed. They're probably sold before the calves hit the ground, something like that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be difficult to find a buyer if you're located in the right area, such as Bozeman, Austin, and you only had 20 head to market a year. Like you said, those would be sold before they're even capped out. Well, of course, you establishment characters want to see the industry grow, because that's more control and influence for you. As the industry grows, you establishment characters are only going to benefit, and then you're going to create rules to keep the small guy out. Isn't that how capitalism works?
No, that's how oligopoly works. Kind of putting on my Turner hat a little bit. When Ted started ranching bison, he did it because he wanted to save them. Let's raise bison. The reason Ted's Montana Grill started was to grow the market. In the early 2000s, I remember I was growing up in Colorado, and I wasn't working for Turner. I think I was probably still in college, and massive drought, 2001, 2002. There were some bison producers there, and there were some of them literally giving bison away or shooting them because of drought. And so there was just zero market at that time. And, Ted went through that. And that was part of the reason for Ted's Montana Grill is to get it out there, get people eating bison, to save them, from a conservation standpoint. And looking back at my history, I got into ranching from a conservation standpoint. I met some really good people doing cool things. And I was like, that's what I want to do. These people are saving open space, wildlife habitat, clean water, clean air, all these things that ranches, productive, profitable ranches provide for society. That's great. That's why I got into it. I was working cow ranching for the first 8 years before I ever saw my first bison up close. But back to your oligopoly question, Ted's motive was, let's get people doing this because it's a good thing to do. Let's grow this species. Let's get more of them out there. Let's get people eating it. Let's create a market for it because then there's a reason more people have bison.
What are some misconceptions about bison?
They're dangerous. They're hard to control. It takes a 7-foot fence to keep them in. Those kind of things. And early on when there weren't very many people ranching bison.
Now, are these misconceptions about the public at large or just a couple neighbors you have?
Public at large. And I think people new to bison ranching too. There's kind of that unknown factor. Oh, it's am I going to be able to keep them in? Are they getting it out? And early on, I think a lot of it was pre emphasis on low stress livestock handling. Kind of pre Bud Williams, and now there's people in Montana. Whit Hibbard and other instructors out there that are making everybody better livestock handlers. And so since that's become more the norm and people are better handlers of animals, it doesn't take that much to keep bison in. Back in 2007-8, I was running some yearling bison behind polywire. It's kind of mid-sized polywire that I was using at that time. But you can do that on irrigated meadows. You can hold bison with, I would start with 2 strands of kind of a larger diameter polywire, but it's doable. Permanent fences. My experience has been electric fence with cattle even before bison. I really like electric fence. I've promised myself I'd never build another barbed wire fence. I've been able to keep that promise to date. I think I made that to myself probably almost 20 years ago. But if you keep that, no matter how strong of a physical barrier you build, if a bison wants to get through it, it can get through it. So it comes down to keeping them satisfied in terms of forage, water, and stress. But if they have those things, then it doesn't take that much to keep them contained. A lot of the fences that we build now, a perimeter fence would be a 4-wire electric fence. Interior fence is a permanent fence. It would be a 2 or a 3-wire electric fence, top wire at 40 to 42 inches. So
what effect, you're a conservation guy, what effect does this fencing have on migration corridors?
That's definitely something to consider, and it's one of the reasons that I would emphasize, getting away from the tall, 5-6 foot fences, because that just impedes wildlife movements. It's kind of easy to raise the bottom wire up to let antelope go through, but a 5 to 6 foot fence is definitely going to stop elk migration and other animals. Plus, add a whole lot of fence maintenance every year. And so, if you can construct your fences where they keep bison in, it's electric fence is a psychological barrier, and once bison learn it, especially the younger that you can teach them about electric fence, the better. It doesn't take that much to hold them. And then a 42-inch high electric fence is really not a barrier for elk, especially if the bottom wire is 20, 22 inches high enough. The calves can get under if they need to. And my thought, if a bison calf gets under a fence, I'm not too worried about it. It'll come back to it. It knows mama's on the other side. So.
Well, those you've addressed some negative misconceptions. What about positive? How about these are disease resistant? There isn't a treatment you need to give them. They can fight off any disease. They're going to calve themselves in blizzards. You don't need to help them along. We as cattlemen help our animals too much through calving. We treat them too much with antibiotics and antivirals. What are some positive misconceptions that might be out there about bison? Maybe you're able to take a position on what I believe to be true. That is a misconception. Is that for regenerative and natural resource management, for soil, water, hydrology management, resource management, that bison are inherently superior to cattle?
I would say the positive misconception is some of the positive conceptions are good, and I'll probably come back around to those. But some of the positive misconceptions I think are that if you had a ranch and you just had one perimeter fence and you put bison in it, that everything would be fine. It'd be perfect. There'd be no overgrazing, and there'd be no issues with riparian areas. It'd be great. It would require zero human management. That's just a fallacy, because there's no ranch that's big enough to allow that. There's ranches that have tried that, taken out all the interior fences, had a perimeter fence, and after a few years started putting them back in, because bison will overgraze just like any species, because they don't have enough room to migrate. And some grazing or recovery periods, we've gotten to where we kind of like to have, for a growing season grazing, we'd like to have 12 to 13 months before another growing season grazing. And if you have enough country, you can build that in, or if you don't have enough, and you have to build that in with grazing planning and some pasture divisions. You have to have pastures. And so the idea that bison can't overgraze, or another way to say that, if it's bison overgrazing, it's okay. That's the misconception. What I would say, there's some positive conceptions, like just due to bison's natural behavior and how they like to graze, it makes some things easier, like riparian management, where cattle might tend to loaf more in the shade, more around those cool areas. Bison will generally do the opposite. To get them to graze the lower, cooler, wetter areas usually takes either some herding or some fencing to do that, especially wetland meadows and like in the sandhills. Bison will kind of avoid those given the opportunity. So a riparian area, let's say in Montana, to get out of the bugs, the bison would be sitting up on a ridge in the same pasture in the breeze to get out of the bugs, and they would just go to the riparian area to drink and then leave. And so that's a little bit easier to manage.
Winter feeding. I know one issue I've heard beef cattle producers having is when they are trying to transition their herd to longer grazing seasons. So they're trying to graze further into December. And ideally, people would graze all year long. Graze all year with minimal amount of supplements, supplemental feeding, not substitutional feeding. But one of the big challenges is that when their herd that they are transitioning slowly, painfully, hears the neighbor's tractor fire up in December, they start pushing on the fence. And I would imagine with bison, they are getting out there and grazing more, just by their natural desire. What nature tells them to do is just go sniff through the snow, break that snow up with their nose or hooves, and get out and move around and seek that forage out more. Whereas cattle are like, you've trained me to wait for the hay wagon, and it's going to take a lot to break that training.
Yeah, one of the physiological advantages of bison. I'll also back up just a little bit. Calving season, it affects nutritional demands for those cattle. So when you need to start feeding and what kind of condition they need to go in the winter and come out of. One of bison's physiological advantages is they go catabolic in the wintertime, and so their metabolism slows way down, and their feed consumption slows down. Their nutritional demands really back off, and so if they go into winter fleshy, you can expect them to lose, maybe 10% of their body weight, but they've got that haystack on their back, and that's okay for them to consume. Once they come out of the winter, it's some that metabolism is influenced by photoperiod, by day length. So once they come out of the winter, they start getting longer. Metabolism starts ramping up. If they have the forage available, they can gain that body condition back prior to when they start calving in April and May. So while they do stay active and grazing and will go out and forage more in the wintertime, then the other benefit is they don't need as much nutritional. They don't have as much nutritional demands in the winter, and there's some strange things about them. How their protein demands. You're talking about supplemental feeding for cattle. Bison's protein demands are a lot lower than cattle. I've wintered some bison cow herds on forage, and it's like 3% protein in the winter, but they're recycling nitrogen through their saliva, and the throughput slows way down as well. I've seen some studies on them where the throughput might be 36 to 40 hours of forage through them. So they're making a lot more use out of that low quality forage through the winter time. Another benefit in the winter is the insulative factor of their hair. And they have a really dense, thick undercoat. I believe the only thing that is more insulated is yak hair, and so they don't need to increase their feed consumption to generate metabolic heat like cattle would. And so there's those advantages too, where you're not, if it's going to be 20 below, some of that feed that you're putting into cattle is just to have them generate enough metabolic heat to stay warm. But with bison, I don't remember the factors. It's been a while since I looked at them, but at what point their consumption needs to go up to generate that heat, but it's tens of degrees below, like a Hereford cow.
Well, let's open up a can of worms here with some bioethics questions. You telling me that sounds like a really good opportunity for cattlemen and humans who like to control every variable we can. We like to eliminate variables. I think we should use CRISPR technology to take some of these positive genes out of bison and implement them in livestock in the continental and British Isle breeds that we have for thousands of years tried to perfect to what we want as an output.
So I don't know of anybody that's working on that, but it wouldn't surprise me if somebody is. That was the idea behind some of the people that were breeding beefalo and cross cattle. And it was actually some of those ranchers that actually helped save the species in the late 1800s. Charles Goodnight, people like that. I don't know enough about the genetic manipulation of mammals to speak intelligently about it, but something just about it. Would they be bison? Would they be cattle? What would they be?
Something about it doesn't feel right.
No, it just doesn't feel right to me.
that we are manipulating nature to the best we can, and creating once it's out there, you can never go back.
Right. Well, there's a recent paper that came out that even the bison in Yellowstone have cattle nuclear DNA in them.
I saw that. Is that true? That every single bison in North America has cattle, beef, a little bit of DNA in them?
At the nuclear level, nuclear DNA. Yeah.
What is that from?
should look at that study a little more closely. Down when there was less than 1,000 head in Yellowstone, there were some other bison brought in to supplement what was there, and those have been on cattle ranches and probably subject to some interbreeding, and so that's, I think, most likely where those that cattle nuclear DNA came in. There's mitochondrial DNA as well that's in a lot of production bison, but it's only passed down to the maternal line, so it's actually pretty easy to get rid of. If you test, there's some people in the bison industry that are purists. If it has any cattle DNA in it, it's not really bison. And there's other people in the industry that looks like a bison, sounds like a bison, grazes like a bison, it's a bison. But it's pretty easy to fix the mitochondrial DNA. You can go from roughly maybe 10% in a herd over years. You just test all your replacement heifers. If they have cattle mitochondrial DNA in them, take them out, they will pass it on to their offspring, and you can clean out a herd over a number of years. That mitochondrial DNA could affect, there are some studies. One of them was done at one of Turner's ranches. The other one was done at Catalina Island, which is an island that has a bison herd off the coast of California.
Those were brought in for a movie and just left there, right?
Yeah. And, there's some of those studies that suggest
that Catalina wine mixer.
What movie was it?
I'm not sure. Well, it's an old spaghetti Western.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a very old spaghetti Western that brought those in, but please go on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, just that bovine DNA in the bison genome, the mitochondrial DNA may affect its performance negatively. So you wouldn't have hybrid vigor in that case.
Mm-hmm. So when I was a freshman in college, Boise State was my university, 2006. I was driving back from Boise to Roberts, Montana, and going through West Yellowstone was the quickest route. And I remember that at that time, there's huge public outcry, and maybe this still happens today. I think it's maybe less in the news, but bison leaving the park, migrating out annually every winter. And I didn't know or care at the time what was going on. But I drove through that area north of the Lamar Valley. And there were people in orange vests and dreadlocks trying to wave the bison back in, trying to shoo them, herd them from imminent slaughter. Because I think part of the controversy at the time was bison who left the park were subject to certain requirements.
Test and slaughter.
Yeah, test and slaughter. And do you think people can really stop a migration? Like, that's, now that I look back on it, the intelligence of the hive that is millennia old, those bison leaving the Lamar Valley, and they're going to go find forage somewhere else, better climate somewhere else. That's kind of arrogant of us humans to think that we could change that.
Well, where are the bison learning to migrate from? And how many generations does that last? I would think if you trained enough generations where those animals are learning from their mothers, you can train that migration out of them. Anecdotally, I've even heard that applied to elk. Elk that have been maybe dispersed by wolves or by a couple of bad winters, where they would maybe be able to winter in one location, but 2 bad winters haven't, and then those calves learn from their mothers, and I would think maybe it's not that hard to change some of those migratory patterns.
So that should be something to look into, because the last time I was in Yellowstone, again on the north side of the park, Gardner, down at the Boiling River, it was springtime again, March. This was just a few years ago. And that's when cheatgrass first comes up in Montana. And everything is just vivid green, lush, like Ireland. But that's exotic. That's That is a pest of a grass species. And I believe that Yellowstone, granted it's the arid West, and we're going to struggle with invasive weeds throughout the entire West. But I believe part of that problem that a lot of people don't see, they just see pretty green when they're traveling down the Gardner River towards Mammoth Hot Springs. It's just pretty green to them, but to me it's cheatgrass. And I think that's from overgrazing bison.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that.
Like, should we put up some 5-wire fence in Yellowstone and paddocks, have some rotational controlled grazing? Do we need some anthropomorphic intervention in Yellowstone?
So I would say, as a ranch manager, I've had the same thoughts when I went through Yellowstone at times, that if this were a ranch, we would be chastised by our neighbors and probably whatever agencies we were beholden to if it was leased land. And so
overgrazing and erosion. Gosh, there's a lot of erosion. And
a lot of erosion. National Park Service units, they're not ranches. Then it is one of those difficult questions. Okay, what is the most appropriate thing for the managers there to do? And the tool that they have, I'll say, because it's not big enough. Yellowstone's not big enough to allow nature unfettered, I guess. That time has passed us. And because they can't migrate out, I think the one tool that the Park Service has now is population control. And they're not going to put in fences. It's also something that's remarkable when you drive through there. I'm used to seeing fences everywhere. And it's one thing I do notice. Oh, there's no fences. And so that stands out to me as a ranch manager as well. But there's valid concerns for neighboring ranches around the park for bison migrating out and the potential spread of brucellosis. But if you track the brucellosis back, it's an elk issue transmitting to bison.
Says the bison guy, pointing fingers at some other species.
So I kind of appreciate the predicament that the Park Service is in there. If you look back, I'll relate it back to elk management and wolf reintroduction. I think there's some conflicting studies on if that was a behavioral change where you see more willow regeneration now in some of the riparian areas in Yellowstone. If it was behavioral or it was just strictly population. And I think the research shows it's probably more strongly correlated with reduction in the elk population than behavioral change. The Park Service was working on that northern elk herd for years prior to wolf reintroduction. And after that combined, there was a lot of heavy hunting on the Montana side. That combined with wolf reintroduction reduced the elk population to a level where you saw more riparian regeneration. Elk are probably a lot more flexible in their habitat choices than bison. Bison prefer more open grasslands. Elk probably diversify a little bit. So maybe that means that the park is still way overstocked on bison. And that's just from reading the landscape, I guess, and not Park Service management goals.
Well, and another option, what's your opinion? Should the bison and elk have the right to migrate north through Gardner onto private ranches that leave gates open and consume, what does a bison consume? 30 pounds a day of forage?
Yeah, roughly.
Should the private landowner be responsible for providing that public good?
So we've now moved from discussing bison as livestock to bison as wildlife.
Yes, and that's the big issue in Montana today, isn't it? Is with the APR, who is being opposed by cattlemen groups. And then I think you bring in the CKST water compact, and I don't want to get too nuanced into that. But part of the fight with Farm Bureau, Montana Stock Growers, Farmers Union was, okay, if we do this water compact and we return the bison to the Salish, Kootenai, Flathead tribes, in that range, the many sections of land that they were that was negotiated in that settlement, along with the tribes of east of the divide, the prairie tribes, are bison wildlife or livestock? And you bring up a good point. Where do you stand on that?
Where I stand on it is they can be both. The ones in the park are obviously held in the public trust, and those are the public's. But the ones on bison ranches are livestock. Yeah. It's the same with elk as well. You know, there are, I think, still a couple of grandfathered elk ranches in Montana, if I'm not mistaken, but there used to be a lot more. And so from state to state, in other states, elk are both livestock and wildlife. So to your question about should bison be allowed to migrate out of the park across ranches, I think I would leave that to those individual landowners. Wildlife can be a burden in various ways. And one of the ways that, at least in our system, in the North American model of wildlife management, one of the ways that landowners can overcome that burden is through something like hunting, outfitting. There would be a burden if a landowner didn't want bison on their property coming out of the park, that they'd have to fence them or enter into some kind of agreement with, in that case, it'd be Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, because those are wildlife, and when they're in Montana, they're managed by the state of Montana. So I wouldn't view that specific case of bison as any different than elk depredation, getting into your haystacks or grazing your winter range. And so to me, it's kind of a similar issue. It's not an easy issue, but it's a wildlife issue at that point.
Yeah, and now you're making me think of kind of social implications. I think we're at this crossroads where everything is so politicized and tribal and political camps, not Native American tribal. We have the American bison, which is for many years has been a symbol of freedom, and it's been a symbol of, I would say, power, manifest destiny. It's been a symbol of conquering the West. It's been a symbol of maybe fighting back from the brink of destruction. The American bison has been very symbolic, and I think for a large swath of people, conservative, not conservative, country, urban, it's been kind of a cherished symbol. It's been it's
a national mammal.
Yeah, it's a national mammal. It's been appreciated. But now with APR, and I'd love to have APR on here to discuss this further, and maybe even with BHA and some of their views about backcountry hunters and anglers, some of their views about right to roam and the public good that wildlife is, and how potentially private landowners, private property rights should be foregone in the name of the public good. It's unfortunate, and I'll just say it's unfortunate to see this beautiful animal become a point of political contention and vilified. And now it's like, if you want to produce bison, you're a weirdo. You're kind of a greedy. What are you, one of them? What are you, a conservation group? You're kind of a out there. You're an outcast. You're not a capitalist. You're not a conservation land manager, natural resource manager.
Why would you say there's that perception?
I think because and this is just going back to my spheres of influence, my network, is there's this purist that it's either cattle and you belong to cattlemen groups, that the self-serving interest is for the livestock, the beef industry that we have invested so much into with the Department of Agriculture, with biosecurity with our state veterinary services, that it's industry driven. We have to protect big industry, and we're going to do that by vilifying bison.
So I'll say the way I look at it personally is, if we're land managers at whatever scale that is, we have the resources that come in. We have sunlight, we have soils, we have water, we have forages, and we have to turn that into something useful for people to create some kind of economic unit that can be sold. To me, that can be cattle, that can be sheep, that can be bison. What's the most? Any of them are valid in my standpoint. What's the most efficient? Depends on how you measure that efficiency, but bison are a way to do it with. They're definitely a lower input way to do it, maybe longer. So I guess I don't see any as being more valid than the other because of the reasons you said, that bison do have the cultural value that they do, and in some cultures, very, very high cultural value. Then I kind of lean towards them. I like that idea of it, and being a native species too. If we can turn sunlight into dollars using a native species and human creativity, I think that's cool.
I agree, and I don't want to see a stigma attached to bison. I brought you on because I think there's legitimate profits to be made. I think entrepreneurially, a lot of people should be looking at bison, especially when right now with $1,200 calves, beef, that market is so cyclical, and I am part of the group of people who believe that it is influenced by the big four packers. I think there is market manipulation in the beef industry, and why would you want to subject yourself to that? To one of the world's largest corporations, Cargill, which is private. We don't get to see their books, but then the other large corporations, Tyson and JBS, that are publicly traded, there is crony capitalism. There is influence on the United States. In my opinion, I'm going to assert this as a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, that there's a revolving door at the USDA and the FDA for JBS, Cargill, and Tyson employees. And why would you want to be part of that? So I hope people critically look.
Are you suggesting there's an agricultural congressional complex?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to get into the military industrial complex, Jeremy?
Or the pharmaceutical complex?
Yes. And so, I mean, if all we can do is keep our own side of the street clean, if all we can do is take care of what's in front of us right here and present each day, wake up and say, how am I going to make this the best day for myself and my family? And if like you said, if you're into converting solar energy into protein, I really think people should be considering bison. And let's try not to have this stigma that they are going to destroy the private property rights of others, that they're going to destroy the beef industry that we have invested so much in.
I think there's some of that it's fear of the unknown. For cattle producers, they haven't been around bison producers, and I'm familiar with the APR situation in central Montana. If that's all that a cattle rancher knows, I can see how they would be highly negative. But I would also, if somebody's considering bison, they should maybe talk to some neighbors of some bison operations, that are ranching bison as a for-profit business. And I know cattle ranchers have both. They have a small bison herd because they like them. They think they're cool, and it's not their core business, but they like them. And Dan O'Brien, he wrote a book called Buffalo for the Broken Heart, and it's about him converting the ranch he still has in South Dakota from cattle to bison, and kind of why he did it and how he did it. And they run Wild Idea Buffalo Company now. That's a pasture harvested, direct to consumer bison company. Been very successful. So there's examples out there, and yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. To me, it's, we're ranchers. We're taking care of the land and producing a living from it, and whatever species you choose to do that with. And back to the private property rights idea. You're doing that on your place. That's cool. Don't negatively affect your neighbors by what you're doing on your place. And I don't think there needs to be that kind of stigma around bison ranching.
Should ranchers who overgraze and farmers who fallow crop, should they be fined then if you shouldn't negatively affect your neighbors with your private property practices?
Good question. So how?
Because they definitively are negatively affecting their neighbors when you overgraze and when you fallow crop.
You're talking about property value decrease or a productive capacity negative impact. For example, overgrazing. How does your neighbor overgrazing affect you if you're not?
My neighbor overgrazing negatively affects me because we have to bail his ass out all the time with government programs.
Or is cattle crawling through the fence always?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's
cows pushing on the fence. But I think the bigger issue is that we reward bad behaviors with farm programs. We keep poor operators going longer.
What about the renewable fuel standard that leads to a lot of overproduction of commodity crops that we don't need?
The renewable fuel standard that set a minimum amount of ethanol that encouraged farmers to go plant corn on soils that would best be in pasture, and it did that because it drove the price of corn up from $3.50 a bushel to $5 a bushel. I think that's also you screwing your neighbor by supporting the renewable fuel standard for ethanol. You are screwing your neighbor because you're making him pay for that subsidy.
So, back to how does overgrazing or fallow affect you? I can see there's a negative, and your question was, should we find them? From a libertarian standpoint, it's how would you account for those negative impacts and mitigate them? I don't know what market mechanism there is to do that.
Forced compliance, nothing voluntary, Jeremy. But I want to get into your story personally before we go off on the tangent of Coulter is continually a blowhard libertarian on this program. Let's talk about how did you come to, you brought up ranching for profit. You've studied all the consultants. You were in Colorado studying livestock ranch management. You follow the gurus. How did you come to this path, this career choice? You said you brought a book with you today that kind of influenced and helped shape your future at the time. Was there an aha moment? Was there a revelation or an existential crisis going on? You don't have to share that, any existential crisis in your life, but what is your story? What path brought you to my podcast today?
Yeah, thanks, Coulter. Definitely was an aha moment, and I'll get to that. I was raised in Colorado, Front Range of Colorado, kind of halfway between Colorado Springs and Denver. born on a small farm in central Illinois, but moved to Colorado when I was young. My dad and his two brothers were butchers and farmed when we were still in Illinois. But growing up, I saw what used to be, Castle Rock, Colorado used to be a cow town, when I was a kid. And it is far from a cow town now. But if you look at it, I would say Montana, the I-90 corridor is probably about 25 years behind Colorado, behind the I-25 corridor, 25 or 30 years. And I saw all the lands and which was ranches and wildlife kind of disappeared between my elementary school years and college years. And just was kind of heartbroken about that, that connection land. Maybe it started growing up on a farm and playing outside and in the woods and stuff as much as possible. But went to Colorado State University and I first started studying mechanical engineering, a year and a half of that, just because that's kind of how my mind works. And decided this is not what I want to do. And so I started a natural resources management degree. And after 2.5 years of that, I was like, what this is training me to do is work for an agency, and I don't want to work for an agency. I want to be in the private sector. And got to my junior year of college and still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was on a wildlife ecology course. And the professor said, if any of you want to go to this conference, it's put on by the Colorado Collegiate Cattlemen's Association. It's called Voices of the West, Solutions Through Community. And he's like, I'll give you excuse you out of class. So I went to that. And there was a panel of ranchers and environmentalists there talking about cooperating and doing good stuff together. And the book that I brought is called Beyond the Rangeland Conflict. It was written by Dan Daggett, who used to be an anti-grazing Sierra Club activist, but now he's writing books about the good work that ranchers are doing for conservation. And one of the examples in there is the Bill Milton's ranch. Bill Milton's featured in there. He ranches up around Grass Range.
He'll be coming on the podcast pretty soon.
Great. Another one featured in there, and they were at the conferences, the Pitchfork Ranch, the Turnells in central Wyoming, where they found, the last remnant wild population of black-footed ferrets. And I just saw it and I was like, that's what I want to do. Like, it was the switch flipped. And then after that, there was just this serendipitous series of events that happened. I went to a friend I grew up with high school, his cousin's dad is also featured in there, Goose Gossage, and he owned a ranch at the time called the Stirrup Ranch in central Colorado. And so I went out there and, kind of doing college things, going out and just enjoying a ranch on the weekend. And I'm flipping through the bookshelf, and Goose Gossage's sister was really involved in holistic management. So she had some holistic management books, and I started flipping through those, and just all this stuff kept happening. And read Small is Beautiful and The Unsettling of America by Wendell Berry. All those books are on the shelf, and they practically fell off the shelf into my lap, and just all this stuff kept happening. So I knew this was it. And my dad was still a butcher in the meat business, and I got out of college and worked my first summer as a seasonal forester for a little while, and kind of worked as a ranch hand on a horse ranch. And then my dad was selling grass-fed beef for Dale Laster and Laster Grasslands Beef. And so I just found out, that the operations manager for Dale Laster got a lease on a 87,000 acre ranch owned by the state of Colorado, got a 25-year lease on it. And so I got in touch with Dale Laster through my dad and just said, this is what I want to do, get into ranching. That was great, And he invited me down for lunch, and he put me in touch with a man named Duke Phillips.
Oh, yeah. He manages the Nature Conservancy, the big.
Madno Zapata.
Yeah.
For the Nature Conservancy. But Duke had gotten a 25-year lease on it. It's the Chico Basin Ranch. And that was 1999. So it's almost up. But he needed some people to work for him, and he needed some apprentices. And I was green. I was an apprentice, and so I talked to Duke and ended up moving to the ranch. I was the first person to move on before we had started receiving any cattle, and I learned pretty quick. The first 6 days, I was horseback all day. Every day we were receiving cattle and moving them to all different parts of the ranch. And after the second day of that, I could barely walk, being horseback every day after, all day, every day. And after the 5th day, I'd kind of ridden the soreness out and, learned a lot from Duke on how to handle cattle, and that kind of the holistic management base. I mean, that's where I got into Alan Savory and holistic management and that kind of planned grazing, and had some good mentors and some good exposure to a lot of people through that. And it brought me to Montana, and I had the opportunity to work for, in a lot of ways, ranch owners that were non-traditional owners. I mean, more amenity type owners, but we ran the cattle operations as for-profit businesses to achieve, but also use them to achieve conservation goals. For example, the Sun Ranch in the Upper Madison. I was a foreman there for 3 years, and it had an easement on it for core elk winter range in the Madison. And so after some years of non-use or little use with cattle, the elk stopped using it, and they started going to the more traditional ranch owners who couldn't afford to feed elk all winter. And so we learned that we needed to graze that forage to keep the quality up, so the elk would stay on the ranch in the winter. We were a seasonal grazing operation, and grazing and outfitting, about 6-month cattle operation and outfitting. And so, kind of always combine that ecological thought with production agriculture. Wasn't always easy. Definitely competing values when there's another book that was written by a friend of mine who worked a summer at the ranch called Bad Luck Way, and it's about a summer of living with wolves on the Sun Ranch, and it's not easy. I didn't sleep much that summer. And, you have competing values in that case, where you have a ranch owner that loves wolves. There's a wolf den on the ranch, a wolf pack on the ranch. You have a cattle owner, because we were custom grazing cattle, and who what he cares about is pounds of gain. And when you have kind of ongoing conflicts with wolves over a summer, and pounds of gain aren't there, then the cattle owner is not happy. And so it's a difficult balance to keep both sides of that happy, and being in the middle of it is difficult. Don't know how far down the road you wanted to go with that, but
no, that's excellent. That fits with a lot of more progressive type managers, thought leaders that we've had on through the podcast. It's hard to get excited about traditional, conventional, and as you said, there's conflict, there's conflicting values, and I'm not talking down on the old value of I'm just going to operate this the way my family has, and that it's part of our legacy, it's my identity. Like, I take no position on that, but it just doesn't excite me. What I like to hear is your story about how do you work with wolves and grizzly bears, and how do you set up a new bison ranch when you know that there's going to be conflicts. No one's going to be too pissed off if you start a yearling stalker operation next to you. No one's going to be too mad if you are if you're feeding your cows all year long and you're not really trying to push them through the winter, and they might get a little pushy on the fences. No one's going to be too mad if you bring in a Red Bull to breed to your black cows. Like, that's I like hearing about the more alternative, holistic. How do we make this work together? Because wolves are part of beautiful nature around us. They shouldn't be removed from this ecosystem. Humans, since they crossed the Bering Straits, the Bering Flats, we've already killed too many species. And it wasn't the Ice Age; it was the humans. People don't like to talk about that when they bring up indigenous, the tribes, and there's kind of this sense of entitlement. I won't get into that, but we have killed a lot of species. We've forced many into extinction, and I think we are a intelligent species. So let's figure out a way to make it work. There's a place for wolves and grizzly bears and bison,
and there's a place for ranchers too. There's a place for people on the landscape and working landscapes out there. Working landscapes keep open lands open for all kinds of other values that they provide for society. I think I listed some earlier, but so if I was involved with a group for a long time too, the Quibera Coalition, and they're not featured in that book, but it is based in New Mexico, but it was started by again a Sierra Club person who was anti-grazing at the time and a rancher in New Mexico. And there's common ground that we have. We both want to see healthy lands, and it was kind of at the height of the range wars, probably in the early 90s when they started this. And it's like we're done with it. Let's create the radical center where let's find win-wins where we can, where we have similar values, and kind of let the others just ignore the other stuff. And that's where I think it needs to be. I mean, if somebody is a wolf advocate but doesn't consider the validity of raising livestock especially on private lands in the West, then they need to come to the middle more. You talked about, I think earlier, not being on the extremes, and there can be cooperation. And I think we need to move. Conflict management. There's something I read recently. We need to move from position to interests. And if somebody's just stuck in their position at both ends, it's going to stay that way or get worse. But if you can move to interest, from the ranching side, what's the interest? Well, to have a profitable business where I can raise my family and have an acceptable quality of life. And the other side as well, we want to have wolves be able to live, or let's say all the native species be able to live in this environment. Those are interests, and there's a whole lot of overlap there. But if you're in the position of there have to be wolves because I don't want to say what those positions are, because I don't know what they are, to be honest. And it's more I have those common interests I just laid out. That's interesting. I think most people can agree on those.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. This is hopefully this has given our listeners a lot to chew on. What are some of the books you've mentioned? Beyond the Rangeland Conflict by Dan Daggett. You mentioned Wendell Berry. I loved Jayber Crow. That was a great book. My wife bought me. Wendell Berry does shit on the conventional farmer though. He's not afraid to but he does it in a poetic manner. In Jayber Crow, it was all about talking shit about that conventional farmer. But what other books have really influenced your management philosophy, or you talked about conflict resolution? What other your professional philosophy, family? What other books are inspiring to you? Because thinking holistically, it's hard to separate profession, family.
Yeah. You just kind of teed one up there, Holistic Management by Alan Savory and Jody Butterfield, and that's a good one. Wendell Berry, I haven't read his fiction books, but a lot of his nonfiction essays. One of his books, a collection of essays, is called Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community. That's a good collection of his essays.
I'll have to check that one out.
Yep. Some publications like the Stockman Grass Farmer. There's always good stuff in there.
Allen Nation.
Yep.
And
now it's Joel Salatin.
Joel Salatin, yeah, he bought
Nation
that.
Passed away.
Yeah.
Allen Nation's book, Knowledge Rich Ranching. You can apply that to bison or cattle. On the leadership side of things, Jocko and Willink and Leif Babin, Extreme Ownership and the Dichotomy of Leadership.
I just read Extreme Ownership by Jocko. Yeah, that was excellent.
The next book's even more important book, I think, The Dichotomy of Leadership.
Okay.
It's hitting that idea of balance, where you need to be. Stephen Covey, 7 Habits.
Oh, yes.
It's a good book. I think we hit on some of that stuff here. So those, and Dan Daggett has a newer book. It's not new. It's probably 7-8 years old, but it's called Gardeners of Eden. And it's that idea that, humans have manipulated their environment for good for millennia. And so, he looks back into the kind of prehistory of that. And it's pretty interesting. And they're easy. I mean, they're picture books, they're kind of coffee table books that you can thumb through and get on out of.
All right. Before we go, we're going to get into another 20-minute conversation here. I got a question for you. There's a lot of people believe that there is this utopian purist ecosystem out there, that maybe Yellowstone or the Arctic are the closest thing to an undisturbed, unaffected, has no anthropomorphic effect. That there are these ecosystems that are pure of humans' impurities. What are your thoughts on that? Because my belief is, well, no, there isn't a corner of the world that has been unaffected by humans. Every ecosystem has some sort of anthropomorphic influence happening to it. It could be the deepest parts of the Amazon. It could be the Arctic.
The
Serengeti. And then getting back to, and it's terribly unfortunate to see the Everglades have these invasive species such as pythons and like iguana things and different animals that should not be in the Everglades are taking over the Everglades. And that's happening everywhere all over the world. It seems like there's invasive species, especially at the plant-based level. However, I mean, I don't want to see pythons in the Everglades, but we have to understand that diversity is always going to happen. There's always a continuum of diversity, of changing, adapting, evolve. My belief is, Jeremy, there's always a continuum of changing, adapting, evolving species. Diversity is a good thing. And yeah, we have pheasants here in Montana. I love hunting pheasants. They're kind of just a natural animal here now. They don't need any management. They found their place. I hope they're not taking away from the natural sharptails. They might be, but they might also be providing to the natural fox. What are your thoughts on this purist utopian ecology? Because it sounds like you're trying to work ranching into a more natural system. What is that natural system, and what are your thoughts on it being pure and unaffected by humans?
Well, at the base of that question, I think you need to move beyond the position that human influence on their environment is invalid. That if we're looking at a pasture, I won't call it pasture. If we're looking at rangelands, and one is obviously unhealthy with lots of bare ground, and just across the fence from that is some rangelands that has reproductive plants. And if the values based is one affected by humans and livestock and one not, which one's better? Well, the one that's in better condition, actual objective rangeland condition, probably has human influence and livestock on it, and the one that is in poorer condition, has none. So you have to move beyond, just that value statement of human influence is always bad. It can be either. And I think what we need to emphasize and always trying to work on is making whatever we do, making things better. And I know that's not easy. It's easy to say that as a platitude, but and it comes down to goals. From a societal view, getting common goals, that's really difficult. If you can pare it down to a more manageable level or sphere of influence, it's easier to get to goals. But let's take trying to think of a scale that's manageable. For example, prairie dogs. Let's say prairie dogs on a ranch. Prairie dogs have a place there. They have an ecological function that can be beneficial to a rancher, but they also have a detrimental effect to their pocketbook. So what's the proper decision and management action for prairie dogs? Well, you have to ask that the vested parties in that, well, what are their goals? I think. And if the goal is maximization of forage or maximization of profit, you'll take certain steps to do that, which might not be a positive influence on the whole ecological picture. But if the goal is I want to work within nature, I want to promote biological diversity, because in the long run, that's probably going to make my ranch more resilient. I would probably take different actions. And it also gets to scale. If you have a 5,000 acre ranch and that's 1,000 acres of prairie dogs, that's a big deal. And versus the bigger picture. So ask me the question again.
Can we get to, I'm going to ask you a different one. Can we get to, as a society, a place on this paradox of nature versus industry? Can we get to a place where nature is the winner, that we have industry, but nature is winning, that we keep our industry, we keep our big dairies that give Coulter really cheap, delicious cheese, because I love cheese and I like $3 milk too. But can we get there by serving nature? Can we keep industry? And furthermore, can we get there with private property rights and capitalism? Or is that going to interfere with having a robust ecology, having a robust ecosystem?
I would say, given the current rate and trajectory, I think we need to change some things, leading toward more kind of regionalization of economies. If you were to look at the large dairies that are providing you the $3 gallon of milk, do you think the $3 is paying for the true cost of that production and all the externalities?
No, someone's bearing it, but we're all bearing it a little bit,
Yeah.
just like a tax. We all just a couple cents here and there.
So I think we can, I would want to measure success in on the, let's to take that dairy example further. Okay, what's the soils on all the lands that provided that milk to you? Are they getting better or are they getting worse? I think that's one way to measure it. Probably the price tag at the grocery store is not covering that, but I think we can make it that way. And I'm not a dairyman, and I'm not going to say that that's easy, because it's not. But there are people that are doing it, but they're doing it at a scale that's probably more regional and more of a human scale than a global or even national scale. And I think that's where things are going to trend. And you see positive impacts, with more regional meat processing coming up. One of the challenges for Montana is we have a lot more protective capacity probably than we have market base, so we're always going to be exporters. A colony of sorts. That's just a factor of population density. And so I think we'll move that way. It's not going to be overnight, but I think going through challenges of the I'm not going to say the challenges of COVID, but I'll say the response to COVID, going through those challenges, have made some people realize that there's some things we probably need to do differently. And I think will come out better, more resilient.
So it has to break before we address it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of time it's human nature not to change until there's enough pain to make them change.
Well, if the fridge isn't broke, Jeremy, don't fix it, I guess is the status quo of how we organize as a society.
Yep. But I've kind of made a concerted effort in the last year to go to a lot more conferences, and they've been in Montana, and just the amount of people on the land that are doing good things and providing good food, good healthy food and fiber for their communities. And that community scale varies somewhat, and making the land better, providing a good quality of life for their family. And that's not necessarily standard of living. In some cases, they're sacrificing standard of living for quality of life that they want is encouraging. The amount of young people that want to get into agriculture is encouraging. A lot of them are not from agriculture. And so there's this kind of influx and interest of people wanting to do the right thing for people and the land. And it's encouraging. And it's easy to say platitudes and things like that. It's not easy. It's going to take a lot of work, but there's a lot of people in this country that need good work and something good and positive to do. And agriculture at a human scale provides that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on. That was an excellent couple hours almost. We're going to get 2 episodes out of this. Appreciate it. If anyone has any questions for you, if they want to reach out and tell you how much they enjoyed the episode, are you on social media or?
You can, probably the best way to find me is on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn. Okay.
Yep, Jeremy Gingrich.
So please find Jeremy on LinkedIn if you have any thoughts, questions, feedback. And we don't do any advertisements on this. So my ask of you is to review this and give me your feedback. Please let me know what you like. We're trying to figure out what people enjoy more. Is it finance? Is it economics? Is it Coulter's libertarian rants? Is it regenerative agriculture? Anything. Please let me know what you like or dislike about this podcast, and that really helps me tailor who I can bring on as a guest. And thanks for tuning into the Ranch Investor, and hope you invest in this bison ranch I'm going to put together with the help of Jeremy and Jeremy's predecessor, another Turner Enterprise gentleman, John Hansen. Go look up that episode if you're really into bison production. John Hansen, former Turner Enterprises. He was replaced, or Jeremy filled his shoes somewhere in Bozeman, the Turner office. Those two had a role. So thanks for tuning in. Ranch Investor Podcast. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm hungry. Okay, that should be it.
Well, how'd I do?
Very good. People love when you kind of slow down and think about like a conscious, methodical answer that you've mused over and you've considered. People have told me they really like hearing that as opposed to radio talk where it's fit as many words into a 30-second time frame as possible. And that's